and his newest book is a slender how-to volume entitled On Disinformation, How to Fight for Truth, the topic of his talk today. So without any further ado, Lee McIntyre.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Wow, what a turnout. This is the biggest ever for this venue. I chose not to have an amplifier because I usually get so excited that I don't need one. But if anybody has trouble hearing me, just go like this and I'll up the volume a little bit. We were just talking over lunch about a podcast that if you have trouble sleeping, there's a podcast that you can listen to of boring stories. You listen to these boring stories and after 5 minutes, it's lights out. That is not my goal. But it's a hot room, we're all packed in here, you've all had lunch and you're sitting on the couch. So the first person who goes out, you get a question. Right? It's going to come down and ask you a question. So I hope I don't put you to sleep. All right. This is the book. It's tiny. You can read it in an hour. It's a manifesto. I told my publisher I wanted them to make it look like the Little Red Book. And they did. They did. And I didn't. I make up book cards, and they're the exact same size. So if you want to buy the book, please take a book card, and you can have your very own copy. Also, it's in libraries. And what I encourage people to do is, because it's so small, you fit it in your pocket, leave it on the bus, leave it in your Uber, give it to somebody else, pass it hand to hand. Because I think actually the stakes are that great, which I'm going to talk to you about now. During the pandemic, I wrote a book about how to talk to science deniers, and I came here and spoke to you about it some time ago. It troubled me that some people believe false things and won't be convinced by facts about evolution, about climate change, about vaccines, even about the shape of the Earth. So what to do? As it turned out, the key issue behind all of this was trust. If a science denier doesn't know you, it means that they probably don't trust you, which means that your facts are meaningless. So my solution was to find science deniers where they were and go out and talk to them face to face, not just about what they believed, but why they believed it. I infamously went to a Flat Earth International Conference in Denver, which I talked about last time. Now, this is a lot harder when talking to science deniers. It's a lot harder than just amassing a bunch of facts, dumping it on them, and then walking away if they won't listen to you. But it's also the only method that has any hope of success. If you yell at someone or you insult them, they just close down. If you open up and engage with them, then you have a chance. It doesn't always work. It doesn't even usually work. But if you read the literature about how it is that some science deniers do eventually change their minds, you'll notice that it always happens in the same way. They finally hear the evidence from someone who took the time to talk to them calmly, patiently, and respectfully. And I think that's because science denial is not really about facts at all. It's about identity and values and community. Science deniers don't have an information deficit. They have a trust deficit. But as I was writing my book, I noticed that out there in pandemic world, the problem just seemed to be getting worse. Worse yet, science denial seemed to be metastasizing into reality denial. Trump's big lie, the January 6th insurrection, all of a sudden it seemed like we weren't just polarized about a few topics in science anymore, but about reality itself. Why is that happening? So I'm at the Center for Philosophy and History of Science. I'm a philosopher of science. I study what's special about science and science denial. A few years back, there was a breakthrough discovery about how science deniers reason, based on some work done by Mark and Chris Hufnagel, later developed by cognitive scientists John Cook and Steve Lewandowski. What they found is that all science deniers reason in exactly the same way. They cherry-pick evidence, they believe in conspiracy theories, they engage in illogical reasoning, they rely on fake experts, and they insist that science has to be perfect in order to be credible. Now, that all sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? It explains why people began freaking out about the COVID vaccines and buying into all sorts of conspiracy theories about the FDA and the CDC. why they believed all those cranks on the internet that demonized Dr. Fauci. Why one unverified report of someone reacting to a vaccine was enough to counterbalance all of the successful inoculations that had taken place. And then I realized that this was also happening in the lies that Trump was telling about the 2020 election. The full title, it's a small book, has a long subtitle. The subtitle is also How to Fight for Truth and Protect Democracy. Wild conspiracy theories about bamboo ballots and Italian satellites. Reliance on an untested partisan polling firm to do the Arizona recounts. And claims that there was no violence on January 6th, right alongside the excuse that all of the violence was committed by Antifa in disguise. It was the exact same blueprint as Science Denier, all of those 5 steps. Now I thought we're in real trouble, not just because the problem of the pandemic had spread into an infodemic, but because even if my go out and talk to them solution worked, we couldn't possibly get enough people out there fast enough to get ahead of the problem. The analogy of the pandemic was constantly on my mind. Rather than just trying to heal the sick during an infodemic, wasn't there some way to keep people from getting sick from bad information in the first place? What's behind all this, and why did the problem seem to just keep growing? I finally accepted the idea that you can't simply debunk your way out of an infodemic. Instead, you have to think about where all the falsehood is coming from. Not just why people believe it, but who's producing it, and why. And that's when I finally discovered the missing piece of the puzzle, which formed the basis for my new book on disinformation that I'm going to talk to you about now. My key insight here was that the kind of denialism we've been talking about both science and reality in general, is largely due to disinformation. I think that's where most denial comes from. Not misinformation, disinformation. Please don't confuse the two. Lots of folks in the media keep mischaracterizing the problem we face today as one of misinformation, but I think that leads down the wrong road. If you think that all those people who believe conspiracy theories about the vaccines or the 2020 election are just making a mistake, you're never going to get to the bottom of it. People don't suddenly wake up one day and wonder whether there's a Jewish space laser causing the California wildfires. Likewise, the idea, or whether there are microchips in the COVID vaccines, they didn't just wake up and say, I wonder. Likewise, the idea that there were 20 suitcases full of Chinese bamboo ballots used to stuff the ballot boxes in Arizona didn't come out of nowhere. Someone invented that lie on purpose, and we know who. The kind of denialism we're talking about here isn't a mistake or an accident, it's a lie. And for a lie, there has to be a liar. That's why it's so important for the media to report on it not as misinformation, because misinformation is like a natural disaster. But disinformation is a lie. Who would lie about whether the COVID vaccines were dangerous, or whether the 2020 presidential election was stolen? The answer is obvious. Someone who had an interest at stake. If we look at where modern science denial started, it's easy to see that these interests can be economic. When the big tobacco companies decided to, quote, fight the science, unquote, which showed that there was a link between cigarette smoking and lung cancer, they engaged in a campaign of strategic denialism. By the way, 2 days ago was the 70th anniversary of that. The heads of the big tobacco companies met on December 15th, 1953. So, 7 years. Their weapon of choice at that point was public relations, which allowed them to manufacture doubt where there wasn't any, and it worked. The public became confused. They suddenly thought that the scientific consensus on the link between smoking and lung cancer was controversial or open for debate. The cigarette companies said, quote, the scientific link between smoking and lung cancer has never been conclusively proven, unquote. We've all heard that. And you know what? They're right. But that's only because the scientific link between any two things has never been proven. I guess they read their David Hume. No matter how good the evidence, scientific consensus always falls short of certainty. That's just how inductive reasoning works. So the tobacco executives who said that we needed more study or more time, all that did was allow them the next 40 years to sell cigarettes. Their interests were economic, and they pulled it off. In their brilliant book, Merchants of Doubt, Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway tell the story of how this success created a blueprint that was later followed by the fossil fuel companies when they decided to deny global warming. And that worked too. I was just listening to a radio show on my way over about this and how denialism about climate change has now morphed into delayism, right? Well, that sounds familiar. They're delaying it so they can continue to sell fossil fuels. So now it's beginning to make some sense. Liars lie because it benefits them. The rewards don't always have to be economic. They can also be ideological or political. But the point is that the people who create the lies behind a disinformation campaign do so because they want something. And the route to getting it is to create an army of deniers who are duped by their disinformation. Now, who would lie about the COVID vaccines? The answer might surprise you. You've all heard of this crazy conspiracy theory that I mentioned about how the COVID vaccines have tracking microchips in them. We've all heard this. But do you know where that came from? Does anybody know where that came from?
QAnon.
And if you read my, what?
QAnon?
No, but they certainly helped to spread it. I tracked it down, and the results were shocking. In April 2020, there was an article, so April 2020.
Wow.
There was an article in an online publication called the Oriental Review, which said that any future vaccines developed in the West would have tracking microchips in them, courtesy of Bill Gates, who held patent 666 on that technology. I knew that'd go over big in this room. At the bottom of the article were little buttons that said share on Facebook and share on Twitter, which many people did. And in fact, by May 2020, 28% of American voters thought that there was something to this idea. And remember, this was 5 months before the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines had even been invented. What the article didn't say is that the Oriental Review is one of 4 English language propaganda arms of Russian intelligence, which they use to pump out disinformation to destabilize the West. Now, why do they do that? Well, various reasons. Of course, there's an ideological motive. While we're arguing amongst ourselves and dying from COVID, we have much less time to pay attention to other things that Russia is up to. Russia has troll farms where they push this kind of stuff out all the time as a kind of information warfare. There was another interest, economic. Russia had the Sputnik V vaccine in development, and they wanted it to be the one that led the way in the world's fight against COVID. They really called it the Sputnik. The market for such a vaccine in Asia and Africa was immense, and of course it's a matter of Russian pride. I mean, right? They called it the Sputnik. So they pumped out a lie to the West where for years to follow, thousands of people died because they were afraid to take their COVID vaccines, which is horrific. And I mean, especially in a room full of people who are sympathetic to humanist views. They didn't care that people died of this. And that's how it's done. A few years ago, there was an article in the New York Times called Putin's Long War Against American Science, which recounts the decades-long history of Russia's campaign to undermine Western science, going all the way back to the AIDS crisis. So this even predates Putin. Do you remember the idea from the mid-1980s that AIDS was invented in a Western lab, and that AZT was poison intended to kill people in the Third World? That was a virulent conspiracy theory in South Africa. There were 300,000 excess deaths in South Africa because of that conspiracy theory. That was Russian disinformation as well. And in fact, way back in the Reagan era, that was one of the things that Reagan asked for against Gorbachev. Stop doing this or we won't help you. And they stopped that one, but they continued on with others. Now, I'm not saying that all disinformation comes from Russia, though they did invent information warfare in the 1920s, and they were very good at it. But what I am saying is that all disinformation works in the same way. And these days, in what I've called and others have called the post-truth era that's been created by the rise of social media, the consequences can be devastating. The goal of disinformation is not just to get you to believe a falsehood, but to distrust and even hate the people on the other side who do not also believe the same falsehood. It's a kind of, disinformation is a kind of team building. It's meant to be polarizing. It creates a situation where you may only listen to the people on your own team. So you may not even hear or trust, if you do, the facts coming from the truth tellers. In this way, disinformation poisons you not just about one truth, but about many truths, about how evidence backs up empirical beliefs in general. Or you may become so exhausted with all of the competing narratives and fact-checking that you just become cynical and you want to give up on the idea of truth altogether. We've all had friends who say, I'm just so tired of it. They all lie. I don't read anything anymore. I don't even listen to the news anymore. Guess what? That's what the disinformer wants you to say. If they can get you to believe the falsehood, that's good. All they really need you to do is to stop caring. Maybe you think there's so little, maybe there's no truth or we can't know it. Autocrats want you to believe that there's nothing that you can do. Because if there's no truth, then there's no blame. There's no accountability. You wonder why false equivalence is a thing. That's the reason. In my 2018 book, Post-Truth, I define post-truth as the political subordination of reality. It's when someone wants something that's at odds with the facts of reality, so they decide to engage in a strategic denialist campaign of disinformation in order to build up an army of believers who can help them to get what they want. In the hands of a corporation, that might result in the creation of doubt over a scientific question that interferes with their ability to make profits. We saw that in the 1950s with the cigarette companies. In the hands of autocrats and would-be authoritarians, this post-truth strategy is perhaps even more dangerous, for it can result in undercutting virtually any facts about reality that you want, whether the crime rate is going up or down, whether the election was stolen, the path of a hurricane, size of an inauguration crowd, whatever you want to be true or not to be true. And that services the consolidation of power. Why did Trump lie about the size of the inauguration crowd? If he got you to believe it, that was great. He did it to assert his power. He did it to show you who was boss. That prepared us for the Trump presidency. But we see it recapitulated now, unfortunately, around the world in other countries where democracy is also in peril. So, how do we fight this? Which is what the book is about, by the way. It's a short book, but at the end it has 10 practical steps that any citizen can take to fight back. The first step is to realize what we're up against. All those people who died during the pandemic as a result of the refusal to take the vaccine, based on the belief in a conspiracy theory, those were preventable deaths. They didn't just die, those people were killed. Not only by COVID, but also by disinformation. They were the victims of someone else's denialist campaign. By the way, that's why it's important to talk to them, to have a little empathy, because they're actually victims. They're doing they don't get anything out of it, they're doing somebody else's bidding. Likewise, consider what happened at the US Capitol on January 6, 2021, and ask yourself why it happened. Was there a special interest at stake? Yes. Were lies used to further that special interest? Yes. Trump didn't want to leave the presidency, so he created a denialist campaign. He followed the trail blazed by 70 years of successful science denial, and he borrowed a few disinformation tricks from Vladimir Putin, and he set in place the big lie, which was at the heart of his ideological and political goal. It sounds shocking, but it's true. Trump's big lie isn't a disagreement over whether an election was stolen. It isn't a difference of opinion or even politics over whether the ballot boxes were stuffed. It was a cold-hearted effort to recruit an army of believers for something that Trump knew was untrue because it served his political interests. So just like what Putin did with the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, that's what Trump did with the 2020 election. And it was when I realized that, and that it was caused by disinformation, that I came to write the new book. People like to dismiss Trump as a buffoon, and in some ways he is, but he's also a near genius level operative when it comes to propaganda. He pulled off what is maybe the first nationwide domestic disinformation campaign in the history of the United States. I guess maybe that's not technically true, because I think back to the Iraq War, but this was a big one. This is why the January 6th insurrection happened. I think there's a straight line between the tobacco executives who met 70 years ago and the people who were on the steps at the US Capitol on January 6th. This is why the vaccines became politicized in the USA. Before COVID, anti-vax was fairly bipartisan. I wonder if you remember that, but it was once upon a time true. There were the people who wondered about whether the MMR vaccine caused autism. And half of them were liberals and half of them were conservatives. And they were all wrong, but half of them were liberals and half of them were conservatives. But maybe that's because some of them didn't like big pharma and some of them didn't like big government, but okay. But what happened after COVID? Anti-vax became politicized. Why? Because Trump politicized it. He saw that it was useful to him to have an army, so he created one. Actually, if you go, there was a story in the New York Times a few years ago. If you go back to Marin County, which was a hotbed of anti-vax years back, and also a very liberal county, a lot of them were not anti-vaxxers anymore. And they interviewed them, asked them why this is, because they didn't want to be misunderstood to be MAGA supporters. So that was the extent to which it was politicized. That also is a Russian tactic. Don't just make up nonsense. Find something where there's already a bit of disagreement. Even better if it's a pre-existing matter of political debate, and then try to widen that crack with disinformation. Pretty soon you'll have people believing things not because they're looking at the evidence, but because that's what people on their team are supposed to believe. Because those are the people that they actually trust, and that, at that point it's not really about facts anymore. The second step in fighting back against all this is this. It's to realize that you have to realize the pipeline. Disinformation is created, and it's amplified, and it's believed. You can attack it by trying to get the creators to stop. Good luck with that. You can fight it by talking to the believers and trying to get them to stop believing it. I wrote a whole book on this. It's hard to do. But in the middle of that pipeline is amplification, and that's where I think we might be able to pinch this off. Now, where does the amplification disinformation come from? We all know it comes from, these days, from many sources. It's well known that Fox News and other partisan networks amplify lies. The Dominion Voting Machines lawsuit against Fox revealed that their anchors were saying things that they knew were bogus, but that they did so to advance their partisan agenda and to satisfy their audience. So let that sink in for a minute. The business model of Fox News is to make money by amplifying disinformation. Some of it came from RT, Russia Today. Some of it was then rebroadcast to RT. So it's not all from Russia, but sometimes it is laundered through a domestic filter. And I hate to say, and some of this is created homegrown too. And I hate to say it, but sometimes disinformation can get spread by the mainstream media too, who often don't even acknowledge that the message from the other side is disinformation, or at least they won't use the word. Here, the interests of networks like CNN and MSNBC are perhaps not as corrupt as Fox, but they are nevertheless driven by some of the same motives. They're all interested in viewer engagement. They all get their ratings on a minute-by-minute basis. Did you know that? The Arbitron ratings, they're not overnight anymore. They're minute by minute. And they all benefit, all news networks benefit from driving a narrative of conflict, failure, and chaos. It's always bad news. There are different ways to be hostile toward the truth. One is to lie, but that's not the only way. There's also confirmation bias and false equivalence, refusing to take sides on a factual matter. that's been politicized for fear of being accused of political bias, etc. When CNN ran a live one-on-one town hall meeting in New Hampshire in front of an audience packed with Trump supporters earlier this year, they gave a textbook example of how not to fight disinformation. Rule 1, you don't give a platform to liars. And of course, we all know that a good deal of disinformation these days is transmitted through social media on sites like Facebook and Twitter, which we're also talking about over lunch. So what are those companies doing about it? And the answer is not much. On occasion, some of the social media companies have taken a stand on content moderation and tried to provide more accurate information on topics like the pandemic and the 2020 election by tweaking their algorithms that are usually more geared for engagement and making them more geared toward truth. We think that's what they did. Nobody knows. They're a black box. But why did they stop? I mean, there was a moment just before the 2020 election when you got content warnings about the election, about vaccines. Now you don't get that. You know what you get now on Twitter, on X? You've seen those little community notes where just everybody can pile in and crowdsource it. Guess who that attracts? Disinformers. I'm not sure we know since Elon Musk's takeover whether Twitter is doing much content moderation these days. One suspects not. The false choice between standing up for truth and tolerating disinformation in the name of free speech seems to have won the day. Over at Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg loves to tout the number of fake messages and fake accounts that they've taken down as proof that they're fighting hard against disinformation. He's actually said in public, if we didn't care, why are we devoting so many resources to it? But of course, that's not the question. The question is whether they're doing enough to fight that's sufficient for the problem. Trumpeting the number of inauthentic accounts you've taken down is just plain whack-a-mole. Remember that young Air Force fellow, he looked like he was about 12 years old, Jack Teixeira, is that how you pronounce his last name? Who was arrested for leaking all that classified information to his gamer friends a few months back. One of the things that came out in that leak was a brag by the Russian military that only 1% of their disinformation on Facebook was being caught. What really needs to happen is that Facebook and Twitter need to tweak their algorithms. The problem is that right now, no one outside the social media giants really knows what's in them. We suspect they're set for engagement, which sounds benign, but we've already seen that when this happens, it's easy for disinformation to be rewarded. Mark Zuckerberg, of course, dissents. He once said it is, quote, crazy to think that Russian disinformation on Facebook had any effect on the outcome of the 2016 election. He later admitted that 126 million Americans saw those posts on Facebook. How many does it take to swing an election? Note, too, that the problem here isn't a simple one about amplification. So when we think of amplification, we think of going broad to as big an audience as possible. But disinformation on social media, you've also got the tools to prune, and here's why that's dangerous. According to Major Jessica Dawson, who's the Information Warfare Team Division Chief at the U.S. Army Cyber Institute at West Point, she's also my friend, I'm happy to say. The technology of micro-targeting allows you to sell denial and hate just as readily as you would sneakers and cosmetics. So the tools that marketers use on Facebook to sell you products are the same tools that disinformers use to recruit you into terrorist organization or to get you to believe whatever they want you to believe. Disinformation isn't just amplified to a broad audience, it's tailored to fit precisely the audience you've identified as most likely to be influenced by your message, which means that some of you will never see that message, and that's why it seems like we're in silos, because we really kind of are. You're not seeing some of the most influential messages. At some level, there's a fine line between marketing and information warfare. So might we push for more government regulation of social media companies? That seems unlikely to happen. Despite a 2021 hearing in which testimony was given by experts on disinformation, both Democrats and Republicans in Congress seemed reluctant to pass any legislation for regulating social media. Biden's Disinformation Governance Board at DHS was disbanded exactly 2 weeks after it was launched. Ironically, because they fell victim to a disinformation campaign about their new director. They should have seen that one coming. And in 2 recent Supreme Court cases, Google versus Gonzalez and Twitter versus Tomna, the court did nothing to help us fight this problem. Part of the reason for such inaction, ironically, is the disinformation pushed out by our government, specifically by the Weaponization of Government Subcommittee in the U.S. House of Representatives, chaired by Jim Jordan, where they're currently branding any effort to study or combat the problem of disinformation as a partisan effort to silence conservative voices. So they're standing up for the right to spread disinformation. And they're doing it under the banner of free speech. And they've got a lot of people who believe that. But you don't beat disinformation by engaging in a free market competition between truth and lies. Lies are just going to win in that way. Just like you don't fix a polluted stream of water by adding more water and clean water. You take out the pollution. Information scientists have shown over and over that in such an environment, lies are seductive. There's a certain number of people who are just going to believe them. In a world that so readily gives every liar a microphone, it's easy for even a few people to have an outsized effect through amplification. You've all heard the adage attributed to Mark Twain about how a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth can get its shoes on. I'm sorry, it was his pants on, I guess his shoe. In a 2019 study, the Center for Countering Digital Hate found that 65% of the anti-vax propaganda on Twitter was due to 12 people. They call them the Disinformation Dozen. So, small number of people, big microphone. How do you fight that? Take away their microphone. Deplatform them. Section 230 allows Twitter, Facebook, any of them, to deplatform anybody they want for any reason, but they don't do it. Why hasn't that been done? I mean, look, it hasn't been done. In case you're wondering, I checked. The night before Elon Musk took over Twitter, I checked and 8 of the Disinformation Dozen were still on Twitter. So you can't blame that on Elon Musk. I mean, they were there the night before he took over. And of course, at this point, the conservative rallying cry of freedom of speech arises. I mean, yes, because wouldn't it violate freedom of speech to silence liars? Well, you could die on that hill, but I also think that that claim is disingenuous. Because here's what I want to say to Elon Musk if I ever have a few minutes alone with him. Refusing to amplify someone else's propaganda is not censorship. Any more than if you were a radical free speech proponent, and so you believed that you had to give a permit to the Ku Klux Klan to go down to Boston Common and have their rally. Maybe you're a radical free speech proponent and you think we have to give them that permit. But you're not required to go to that rally and help them hand out flyers, are you? But that's what Twitter's doing. They're amplifying the message. Do we have to tolerate the message? Maybe so. Do we have to help them amplify it? We do not. So what can the ordinary citizen do? We might try to get our politicians' attention through better outreach, advocate smarter regulation. Maybe we don't want Congress to be the fact checker in chief. That seems like maybe a dangerous prospect, depending on who's in Congress. They have that model in Turkey and Russia and a few other places right now where the government has really great tools at fighting disinformation. They'll throw you in jail for 10 years if you share fake news. It kind of depends on which government is in place. So I'm not so sure that I want the solution to be for the U.S. government to be the fact checker in chief. But here's a thought. Why not have them regulate more transparency in the social media algorithms? This idea is due to Stephen Lewandowski, who I mentioned earlier is one of the leading cognitive scientists on this issue. Why couldn't we have an independent group of researchers outside the tech companies, maybe university-based researchers, where we blinded all the user data, so we were protecting people's privacy, and we could see what was in the algorithms, and we could anticipate trouble. Why do we have to wait for a whistleblower to come forward? Why do we have to wait until people are already hurt? Isn't there some way, to get ahead of this? I mean, they do that for medicines, they do that for toys, they do that for cars. Independent experts have to look at it. And I want to ask you this, too. This is something else I'd say to Elon Musk. If he's such a fan of free speech and openness, why are his algorithms so opaque? Why doesn't he open them up to the scrutiny of outside experts? Just open it up. Truth will rise to the top. Yeah, sure. We also might use grassroots tactics to demand that our news sources do a better job. Why do MSNBC and CNN continue to book liars on their programs? Soledad O'Brien, who used to be on CNN, not anymore, she was the one that famously said, "Stop booking liars on your programs." Sounds like a pretty good idea. Why do shows do it? I think because they want to show that they're fair-minded. They are allergic. Most journalists, mainstream journalists, are allergic to the claim that they're politically biased. People who are really biased, I mean, look, do people at Fox News get upset over claims that they're politically biased? Not really, because they are. But mainstream journalists, they don't want to be accused of political bias. And so they will bend over backward to have somebody on their show to tell the other side of the story, even when there isn't another side. But that is not how you should report on a factual issue. You don't fight perception of political bias by feigning indifference between the truth and a lie. Or as Stuart Stevens said recently, how do you tell both sides of a lie? You can't. I think that a few hundred letters from viewers might begin to change how they do that. So even your favorite news source, you can write to them and say, I don't like, or write to their advertisers too. That sometimes works. But, and I outline some other steps in the book that we can take. But we better get busy with all this, and soon, because the problem is about to get worse. Here is where I say all sorts of scary things about large language models and AI. I'm not going to say it, because you already know what I'm going to say. But what I want to close with is this. We can't leave these battles to others to fight on our behalf. In the past, information warfare was in the province of governments fighting one another. And it was sometimes an ancillary part of kinetic warfare. But you didn't tend to see it created by a domestic audience for domestic purposes. It was warfare between governments. Today, there's plenty of homegrown disinformation to contend with. And that problem that I mentioned earlier, which is that disinformers overseas today tailor their message so that it is as quickly as possible picked up by a domestic news filter and laundered, right? So they want that story to be laundered because guess what? America has great cyber warriors, but the Constitution prevents them from fighting against domestic disinformation. So if Russian disinformation can get laundered through Fox News, that's a win-win because then the army can't touch it. And where are we? The USA and some other democracies around the world remain a whisper away from autocracy. And that's the kind of political power is the ultimate goal, I think, of the disinformer. Authoritarians long ago learned that the best way to control a population is to control their information source. And as we've seen in a post-truth environment, the goal is not just the promotion of the falsehood, but the political subordination of reality. We see this today in electoral dictatorships like Russia and China, where they still have elections but they don't count. We also see it in putatively democratic countries like Hungary and Turkey, which I don't think are really anymore democracies. And we see it coming, possibly, in the United States. We can soothe ourselves that we've seen the worst, that we've already beaten back the forces of autocracy, but I'm not sure many people believe that anymore. There's another presidential election coming up, as we all know, in November 2024, and just imagine what Trump might have planned for a second term. And I've got some other material here on George Orwell, but I'm going to stop because I have made my point. What questions do you have for me? And I hope at least one of them is on Orwell.
Just a tiny detail towards the end. You talked about we shouldn't give a platform to liars.
Yes,
But government does sometimes lie.
yes.
And so I think you should put in the word inveterate liars.
Yeah, you know, if they didn't book liars, Meet the Press wouldn't exist, right? I mean, it's, you know, it's somebody from Congress, and, you know,
But we have our CIA and our...
yeah,
you know, what I'm talking about.
let me draw a distinction here. You raise a good point. I mean, let me draw a distinction here between liars and disinformers. I mean, disinformation is a type of lie, but not every lie is disinformation. I mean, you have people who lie for various reasons, for personal gain, because they don't want to hurt somebody's feelings, because, you know, just all the reasons why people lie every day. But disinformation is an organized, strategic campaign of lies. It's the weaponization
Well,
of
vicious
information.
disinformers would be a term.
Yeah. Okay. I'll have to. Yeah. I'll have to tweak that a little bit, because
Other people
you're
should.
right. If we didn't book liars, there'd be a lot of dead air on cable news.
Yeah, problem's not entirely back in the 50s, you had people like McCarthy period,
Yeah.
and like Senator McCarthy's claims were being amplified by the mainstream media,
Yeah.
and there were people like I.F. Stone were criticizing the mainstream media for doing that, but the mainstream media did not really change their ways,
And why not?
because they media like to present itself as being a neutral
Yeah. I mean,
communicator of what's
it was
good.
newsworthy.
Yeah.
That's one thing that people say. Oh, look, you know, even if Trump's lying, he's the president. It's news.
Yeah.
Some of it's to inoculate against claims of political bias.
Yeah.
Of course, these days it also makes them a lot of money. Why did CNN run all of those town halls from Trump with no commercial breaks and no analysis at all? Those were a gold mine. Their revenues more than doubled, I think, during that period, because, you know, people were, I mean, they were making money on it. I don't think the news companies made money back in the McCarthy era, but they you know, you're right, they had other motives for doing it. Did they?
Time magazine, Henry Luce
Well,
was the
okay. Sorry, I was thinking.
profitable.
I was thinking of the public air, the folks on TV, right, where the news was kind of a lost leader. But actually, they needed it. They needed the news because they were using the public airwaves, and they needed to be able to say that they were doing something in the public good. So there was, you know, a half an hour a day of news, and then the rest was all entertainment, whereas where they made their money. But yeah, Time magazine, there were others that were making money.
I was thinking, heaven forbid, a year from today, we're all in this room together,
Yeah,
and Trump has won.
yeah.
What are you going to stand there and tell us we can do besides heavy drinking?
I will be in England, no. Look, there are brave people all over the world. Navalny is in prison. Nobody's seen him since December 6th. Navalny is Putin's main critic, vocally his critic. Putin poisoned him in another country, and then somebody else was Navalny. And he voluntarily went back to Russia where he was in prison. So I mean, there are brave people, and we can be brave people. There are alternatives, and one is not to elect Trump. But if he's elected, resist.
How?
Well, there's another book this exact same size that I didn't write, called On Tyranny,
I've seen it.
by Snyder, by Tim Snyder. It is an excellent book about how to resist and fight back against tyranny and autocracy. And it was a very helpful, it came out just after Trump was elected. And his book was part of the inspiration for mine. I mean, his book's called On Tyranny, mine's called On Disinformation. That's not a coincidence, okay? Because his book was very helpful for that reason. I think it could be helpful again. I mean, there was a lot of resistance at the beginning of the Trump presidency. The Women's March, the March for Science, I mean, God, he went to all of them. And I mean, people can fight back. It would be harder. I mean, not say will, in a second term with Trump, because he knows he's going to hire loyalists, and he's already sort of said what his second term agenda is, and it's straight autocracy. I mean, he's not going to be shocked anymore. He's going to do his thing. Yeah.
He'll
I mean,
be
how
having
can
a problem even if he loses the election.
I agree. Yeah, 2024 will be horrific around that time of year, no matter what. And I really will be in England during the election, but I do plan to come back.
So far.
I do plan. No, I do plan to come back in January.
Have you given up on trying to deal with the trust issue?
No, it's just we need both and. We need talking to deniers face to face and trying to keep more people from becoming deniers. It was hard. Maybe it's just cognitive dissonance in my mind, but it's hard to write a whole book on something and then see the problem get worse. But I no longer think that there's only one solution to this problem, or that the solution I proposed was scalable. I still think it's the right thing to do. I think it, and you know what? If you read the anecdotal accounts, the only thing that has ever worked in convincing deniers to come back is patient, respectful conversation. But if you ask me, do I think that's going to be enough? I don't think it's sufficient. Yes.
Actually, related to trust too, what I'm surprised by is how this image of those people who are victims to disinformation go about the world only based on trust, and us, vaccine believers, don't. I don't know how modern vaccine works. It's all based on trust. I don't know science behind climate change. I know some things, but I don't know most things. I don't know how ibuprofen works. It's all trust. I just trust different people, and they trust different people.
Bravo.
And we operate based on exactly the same principles that they operate. So I think this distinction is false, and it's all
Okay.
who you trust. And for some reason, I decided that I trust these authorities, even though there are other authorities that I don't trust. So I think it's more nuanced and difficult.
It's interesting. I mean, I like what you said, because you're pointing out that this is not somebody else's problem. This is our problem. We're all susceptible to this, because even people who believe in science based on trust. I don't know how an airplane works, but I get on and I trust the pilot. Now, but let me dig down here for a minute on why we trust scientists in this room, I hope, and why some people don't.
We don't trust all of them.
Well, maybe we don't trust all of them on all issues. But the issue, I think, is this. Even people who are deniers are not usually anti-science. They trust scientists on many, many topics. They only are deniers on the specific topics on which they have been disinformed.
Yes.
They're deniers about about climate change, because the fossil fuel industry gave a boatload of money to deny that. They're deniers about vaccines, because there are political and foreign interests in that. You know, there are. So if you look at the topics on which people are disinformed, that's who they distrust. I saw this with the Flat Earthers. They came to the Flat Earth Convention, and the leading conspiracy theory behind Flat Earth is that every airline pilot, scientist, and government official and professor is in on the plot. Well, most of them flew there. So they trusted the pilot enough to get them there, but they didn't trust them about the shape of the Earth. And they were on their phones live tweeting about the event. Unironically, well, maybe they didn't know that that was satellite internet traffic, you know, going around. I mean, so, yeah, I think of deniers as cafeteria skeptics. They walk through the line and say, I'll take a little of this and a little of this, and I don't like that, and I don't like that. And how do they know what they like and what they don't? Because somebody told them, don't trust that, don't trust that, because that person had an interest. You raise a really important point, though. which is that trust can be broken for all of us. And if you talk to science deniers, they usually have an origin story about when their trust was broken. And that's how they became science deniers, because once their trust was broken about 9/11 or whatever it was, then that's a scary moment.
Yeah.
And then you want to see how deep that rabbit hole goes, and sometimes it goes all the way to flat Earth. I mean, that's what I heard from an awful lot of science deniers, that's when I realized it was a breach in trust. So trust is important, even for people who believe in science. I think that a lot of people who believe in science don't really understand it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of it's happened over history. There was a telegraph, there was the printing press. There have been major media changes, and whether it's the Bible, the printing, books, and so on. And so one could historically look back at all these things. There have been very bad periods. There's been Hitler periods. There's been thousands of years before then bad periods, and then they went away. So my question is, do you see any harm, do you see anything technologically? Do you see anything metaphorically to what's happened in the past? A movement, a person, like Trump's a person? Is there some counter person? Is there anything, or is it so inconceivable because it's the future? But in doing all of your research and looking at the past, have you seen examples of how this has been solved in the past?
The thing that I love that question, because one thing that I've worried about more and more over time is this. Technology makes the world smaller. We hear about things going on all over the globe. It used to be that you had a Genghis Khan, but he was sort of in his area raising havoc and didn't affect other parts of the world. Now, the entire world is one community. It's kind of like before you had these little waves, and sometimes the little waves would wipe out a whole community, but now these little waves are together in this one big wave that who knows what it could lead to. It's right now leading to an existential threat to humanity with climate change because of the disinformation about fossil fuels. It's also, look what just happened with COVID. We had denial all over the world. But by the way, the Russians overshot with their little disinformation campaign. I mean, they had people refusing to take the Sputnik vaccine because once that genie's out of the bottle, right? But how many people died around the world because they believed that kind of nonsense? I mean, so the thing that I worry about now that's different from past eras is we've always had the ability, when trouble is isolated, it can be dealt with. But when it's worldwide, then it can become an existential threat. And the example I'll leave you with is pandemics. You could have local outbreaks of disease, but now with plane travel, it's all over the world immediately. I mean, how long did it take before the pandemic started in Wuhan, before it was worldwide? Not that long. My grandma lived through the Spanish flu pandemic. It took months. It took months for that to get around the world.
But countervailing all of this, what you're saying, isn't there another totally opposite concept, and that's the concept of how powerful a single person is now. Someone down their basement can develop in their own biolab do-it-yourself biology. They can go off and via hacking send out viruses. They could also hack and all of a sudden control all the communications and put out whatever message they want. So a single individual now is amplified. And that amplification could be a counter to what you're talking about if we had some very benevolent, the other one, of course, is if you have some major breakthrough and there's no more cancer, we've lost $400 billion worth of industry in this country.
Look, it could, if we had a benevolent person in that position, that could save the day. What if we had a malevolent person in that position? Then we're in real trouble. I mean, one of the scariest books I've read recently is this, The Handbook of Russian Information Warfare. This is NATO, a NATO training manual. You can get it for free. I wrote to them in Italy, and they sent me one. You can get it in a PDF right now. This is a super scary book because it's all unclassified information. A lot of it's translated from the Russian. But it's a training manual for NATO soldiers written by a NATO researcher so that we know what we're up against. And there are all sorts, and you can see, there are all sorts of things in there about where we are in this disinformation war. The main thing that I want to say to people about disinformation is you can't win an information war unless you know you're in one. If we keep denying the fact that we're in one, then we're in big trouble.
Yes, I'm familiar that some of the European countries have the evening news program, which is, this is the latest disinformation from Russia. Here's, we're going to debunk this. And they do that like, a segment of the evening news.
Yeah, isn't that nice? Finland has an entire curriculum in the elementary school on how to identify fake news. We can do a lot more here. And you know what? That's fun. Kids love that kind of
it's
thing.
a big detective,
Detective, there's some people who do that here in the United States. So Scott Bedley was an educator in California, won Teacher of the Year. He had fifth graders, called it the fake news game. They loved it. They wouldn't go out to research. Give us another one, Mr. Bedley. Why don't we have more like that?
Right.
The importance of creating trust is such a critical one. But and I've been at a number of workshops at MIT and Harvard in the last month or so, looking into the impact of AI on everything: AI on democracy, AI on education, AI on mental health, and just as we sort of come to a place where there's even the remote possibility of trust, the deep fakes world kind of takes over. So I'm just wondering if you have kind of a take on that, and alluded to it a little bit, but how we begin to make sense of the impact of deep fakes that nobody is going to be able to identify.
Yeah.
And you're skeptical of everything.
So you were at the lunch table a minute ago where you heard me refer to a VCR. So I'm not going to pretend to be a great tech expert here. But I'm a philosopher. But I will say this: the threat with deepfakes, the threat with AI is this: what can happen with pictures, with language, with audio? It's the same. Is this? It's not just that you take the fake thing for true. It's that you take the true thing for fake. It will sooner or later, as it gets good enough, be the end of video evidence, the end of audio evidence. I just read the other day in a law journal, lawyers complaining that they were now going into court and having jurors be skeptical that video evidence was credible because it's, that's just fake. So, and AI is just going to make that better and better.
Worse,
Yeah, you've seen, worse, right? AI can do incredible things. And one of the part that I kind of over, because you all knew it, was that AI makes disinformation better. Yep. And yes, there are certain safeguards right now. The first thing, of course, I'm perverse. The first thing that happened when ChatGPT came out, I tried to make it give me false information. I'm just kind of trying to wreck it. And so I went straight for vaccines. Couldn't do it. Couldn't get it to do it. And part of me thought, that's really good. Somebody over there, Stanford, cared about it. And then I thought, oh no, that means it can be diddled with.
Yep.
And the minute it gets in the hands of the wrong person, they can diddle with it.
Yeah.
So what I worry about is anymore, one of the great barriers to disinformation has been its quality. One of their main screening tools in Russia is facility with the English language for their troll farms. And the quality of the disinformation that comes out, if you saw something in 2016, it's not that good. It doesn't, I saw it makes you laugh sometimes. One of the memes that I saw, instead of, it didn't say Black Lives Matter, it said Black Matters, right? Well, okay. or they have the apostrophe in the wrong place, or there was one with Colin Kaepernick that said, "Happy birthday, real American." It's just not American, not English diction, right? That's not going to be a problem anymore. AI can make better and better disinformation. They're not going to need a troll farm. They're going to have a troll garden. They're going to have one kernel in there with 1,000 pages, computers of ChatGPT going and churning out great stuff. It is really scary.
Just a comment here that one of the many problems I see us facing in the next year, 2 years, whatever, is the rise of a new religion. Because the problem, one of the big problems I see with AI is it's rapidly going to create a priesthood. I consider myself highly educated, and lots of pretty well everybody in this room considers themselves highly educated, but I am already aware I do not have the vocabulary or the capacity to play AI. And so I'm going to be reliant, for a trust issue, I'm going to be reliant on a new set of priests.
You mean priests in the, are you using that in a figurative sense, or do you mean actually a new religion?
Well, probably more figurative, but it's this issue of having they're going to be in control of the word, which of course historically has been a very big issue related to that gentleman's comment about, the printing press and what have you.
Yes.
But we are, I remember several years ago, quite a few years ago, my husband and I used to take a magazine called Art and Architecture. And we gave up the thing because we couldn't follow the vocabulary, which had gotten so esoteric.
Oh, I see.
You know what I mean?
I see what you mean.
But now, AI it's not just in a small category of the culture. AI is going to be running the game, and I, as a citizen, don't have access. And so there's going to be, that's what I mean by a priesthood.
It reminds me, what you said reminds me of the influence of gaming, the gamers on information. Well, I read, I can't remember the source now, but it was a fascinating article about a guy from the gaming community who said that he saw this in QAnon. It was kind of this pattern-seeking development of the human brain where you look and there is no pattern, but you will find one. And then when you find it, then you level up to the next one because you were just rewarded for that. And so you end up with these weird correlations and beliefs based on what you think you saw, which couldn't have been a coincidence because there it was, and how improbable would it have been, for these two things to be put together. So, and that's kind of fascinating, isn't it? Because if you put people in the mindset, we are pattern-seeking creatures. If you put us in an environment where there's ambiguous information, but there's enough information, we'll find patterns even if they don't exist. And in that sense, I see exactly what you mean. And how hard is it once that happens to begin to fetishize it, to invent a new vocabulary, to invent new rules and understandings for it? I wish I could remember where the article came out. Maybe somebody in the room read it, but it was it in Rolling Stone or Vox or something? It was a popular article by a gamer about QAnon. And it was just, and I don't know much about gaming, but it was fascinating. Yeah.
You had mentioned 3 stages in disinformation, where the first stage was producing it,
Yeah.
the second stage was amplification, the third stage was belief. And then, if I remember right, you were dismissive about efforts to intervene at the very, very first stage. I think you said something like
Production.
Good
luck.
Good luck with
Yeah.
that. So,
if you've got an idea, I'm all ears.
well, I wanted to know, because that was more than I knew in a sense, so I was wondering if you could elaborate on the futility of that.
I'm just trying to think of the U.S. Congress passing a law which would keep Putin from producing disinformation. I don't think it could be done. For a lot of, look, I don't mean to keep harping on foreign disinformation because there's an awful lot of domestic disinformation as well. But a shocking amount of disinformation comes from China, Iran, Russia, Saudi Arabia. A lot of the disinformation about fossil fuels comes from Saudi Arabia.
There's a difference, though. The first information from Russia,
Yeah.
and maybe from China, is resentment about our having won the Cold War.
Now,
It's
that might be the
payback.
motivation.
Hatred and payback. Saudi Arabia isn't hatred and payback, it's merely economic interest.
Well, disinformation can happen for many reasons, economic, political, theological, I mean, there are different reasons, but look, trying to figure out why somebody wants you to believe
To
something
win
false.
when the other side is defeated
Yes.
leaves a poison pill of resentment for the defeat. That's the point of it. It's a Gandhi point.
What about the tit for tat? That there's a whole highly intricate tit for tat, where someone dare not, well, you could say, get rid of the drugs, bomb their fields, get rid of it, make drug fighting drugs a military thing, not a police thing. But then you might find, well, the mafia types are going to go off and kill the politicians' families. And so it's a tit for tat, it's inherent, and so we know if we did this, then something would go after us. So there could be a bribery system going on, but it also could be a tit for tat. It's why maybe they did not go after Hoffa, and for a long period of time, Edgar Hoover completely stopped going after organized crime because they had pictures of them.
I don't have a lot of, look, I don't have a lot of confidence that this problem is going to be solved at the level of government or corporations, you know, just the incentives that they have. I'm putting my faith in grassroots efforts by citizens who, once they understand the stakes and what's happening, can do more. Individual resistance amongst millions of people at once. Yes, and then
Point of information. I have a quarter-century experience on the Pacific Rim because Donald Rumsfeld set me out there for basic training in '69. China loves American consumers. I mean, China's Industrial Revolution was financed by American tourism and American purchase of Chinese-made products. Even though Walmart said that they wouldn't be carrying Chinese products, they became the #1 seller of Chinese products. So, you know, there's a huge misconception about China and how it enjoys the American economy. I also end up, after I got the contract to build the road in the United Nations China Tumen Delta project from Siberia out to the Sea of Japan, the six-nation project. I came back here to my birthplace, and all my time out on the Pacific Rim there, mostly in China, especially bringing out American tour groups, because I also built the first American motel in China, is that China loves Americans. You know, not just for the money, but China admires the culture and therefore has emulated driving around all over the place with cars now. They're electric cars, but they're enjoying America's greatest freedom of travel, driving anywhere in the country.
and yet,
There's a,
and yet they're a purveyor of disinformation.
well, you know, information everywhere has different types of information. You know, you can read misinformation even in the periodicals that are published here. But
You can, but the Defense Intelligence Agency and other American military, you know, the U.S. military studies where this is coming from, and the three biggest sources of foreign disinformation coming to the United States are Russia, China, and Iran. I don't have the footnote in my back pocket on that. I can give you something.
Is it worth drawing a distinction between Chinese government and Chinese people?
Yeah.
The same way the Iranian government
Yes.
is kill America, the Iranian people love us.
You hit
Yes.
That's completely different.
but they will just go to the right-wing social media sites of the tech companies, ban them, and they will become morons.
So I think Chris's concern is the spreaders of disinformation, if they're banned by social media sites, they'll go to the right-wing media, and then there will be an extremization of right-wing media, right?
So even more polarization, more siloing.
Right.
That may be true, but I think that the people that I'm the most worried about hearing this information are the virgin ears, the ones who have never heard it before and wouldn't hear it in another way. If somebody's already in an echo chamber where they're just hearing it over and over, I'm not sure how much stronger their beliefs get over time, but it's the I'm not a psychologist, so I don't know what the precursors are to this, but one thing that's always fascinated me is, you know, the mindset, not only what they believe, but why they believe it. It seems to me that anti-vaxxers that I talk to, even climate deniers, even flat earthers, a lot of it's based on fear. Fear is often the mindset. So what I worry about is the virgin ears of fearful people in times of concern and strife, hearing false information and falling for it because they're scared. And if we can keep them from hearing the disinformation, I think that's a benefit.
Yeah, I know that
you've been waiting a long time.
I know I've been using trust as a characterization of with respect to authority and so forth, and all these issues going on. But isn't really epistemology the heart of the issue, that we for ourselves have to know how we know knowledge or something is true or not? Isn't it really up to us to decide for ourselves via epistemology principles that this is more likely true or this is more likely probable, and instead of just trusting this authority?
So I'm a philosopher, so you know I'm a big soft target for what you just said, right?
Yeah.
Because yes, epistemology, absolutely. But if the solution to this problem is that we all need to become our own fact checkers, we're doomed. We need trust.
Yeah, but you still need to think about yourself. I mean, I think a lot of this issue with the disinformation is that too many people don't think at all.
Yes.
And they just say, okay, this authority figure tells me what to do, so I'm going to do it. I think it still behooves all of us as human beings to use our humanity and our nationality to think for ourselves.
I agree with you, and I think that's maybe even the first duty in an infodemic. And what do they say on the airplane? Put your own oxygen mask on first before you help others around you. My friend Andy Norman has written a book called Mental Immunity, where he's also a philosopher, epistemologist in fact, where he's got a program that you can learn about how to inoculate yourself through critical thinking against mis and disinformation. Based on science, even though Andy's a philosopher, it's based on science. Full disclosure, I'm part of the think tank that Andy founded called CIRCE, where we're working on some of these issues with some cognitive scientists, one of which is Stephen Lewandowski, another is Sandra van der Linden, who's got a new book out called Foolproof, John Cook. So there's some science behind exactly what you're saying. What I worry about, though, is if it's again, like my answer over here, it's both and. We need to try to do that for ourselves, but we also need to try to stop the amplification.
So, first of all, CIRCE is spelled?
CIRCE. The Cognitive Immunology Research Collaborative.
Thanks. My question was, so skepticism, epistemology, and mental immunity, how do we take this to the schools, like Finland, for instance? I presume that was a government thing, but...
We're working on it. CIRCE is working on that very problem. Because everybody talks about critical thinking, but what does that mean? And what's the curriculum? So one thing that CIRCE is doing is designing sample curriculum. And there was another.
These gentlemen already touched on this issue of most people are not critical thinkers, and you want to keep them from hearing the disinformation, the burgeoning ones, you want to keep them from hearing the disinformation. Well, good luck with that.
Okay.
That's not going to happen. But what avenues do you see to inoculate them? You mentioned only one, and that was a media literacy program for children.
I've got a good one for you. Sander van der Linden, as one of the leading cognitive scientists in the world at the University of Cambridge, he's got a book out called Foolproof, and he's one of the major advocates for something called pre-bunking. So you've heard of debunking. Somebody believes something, you try to get them to give it up. Pre-bunking is when you get to the person before they hear the mis and disinformation, and you try to inoculate them so that when they hear it, they're more skeptical. So imagine you're in a situation where somebody tells you a lie, and then somebody comes up later and says, you know that guy was a liar. You go, no. I mean, this is just human nature, right? Mark Twain said that it's easier to fool someone than to convince them that they've been fooled. Okay?
How does that scale?
Okay, but pre-bunking is when you get to them first and you say, that guy's going to lie to you. And then and then the guy comes up and lies to you, and you're not so soft to target anymore. And so he's got a whole book on this, on pre-bunking called Foolproof, where he's a scientist, where he talks about the science behind it. But one thing that he's working with CIRCE on is how to make this into a curriculum. By the way, the government is using this. Biden, during the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you remember that moment when Russia had the troops all the way around, and everybody was just waiting for them to go in, and they needed a reason, like a pretext, the fig leaf, and they were going to stage an atrocity. They were going to have people come in, dressed up as Ukrainian soldiers, create an atrocity. They had a film crew. They're going to film it, and Biden immediately had the information declassified and pre-bunked it. And so they didn't. Now, they immediately found a different pretext to invade because they were going to invade anyway. But the point was, he didn't allow them to do that. And so pre-bunking is actually one of the things I'm most excited about. There's an excellent article in Nature Human Behavior in 2019 by Cornelia Beitsch and Philip Schmidt. Beitsch is B-E-T-S-C-H. And it provides the first empirical evidence that you can debunk science denial. Now, empirical evidence that this is possible. Van der Linden did a commentary on it in which he then argued, yes, and you can also pre-bunk. So that's two different tools that we can use, which have science behind them. Stuart,
maybe one more question?
What are your blockers that are preventing you to take your program to schools and cancel programs to the universal?
The blockers, time and resources to design. I mean, look, to get anything through a school committee is kind of difficult. But right now, there are folks other than me working on how to frame this. I mean, CIRCE just started, and so it's difficult. We've been around about a year, and so it's hard to just have enough time and resources to get it put together. But we're working on it, and this is the problem, isn't it? Always one step behind the disinformers, and not enough time, and the election's coming up. And the other thing that I point out, and Andy hates it when I do this, the kids are not going to save us. No matter how quickly we get this into the schools, we can't wait for them to grow up and save us. We got to do this now ourselves. Well, that's what mental immunity is for. It's an adult education program about how to do this. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for this sobering